Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America, by Tracie McMillan, narrated by Tavia Gilbert. I am so tired of waiting. Aren't you? For the world to become good and beautiful and kind. Let us take a knife and cut the world in two, and see what worms are eating at the rind. Langston Hughes, Tired, 1930. Author's note: on method and language. Method. This is a work of journalism, based on documented facts. This is true of the stories of my subjects, of myself and my family, and of the larger historic, political, and social story I tell about this country. Still, because this is also the story of 5 families and communities over time, I often had to rely on personal recollections as well. I have conducted hundreds of hours of interviews, cumulatively with my subjects and their friends and family and colleagues, and interviewed my own family. In some instances, placing my subjects' stories in context required the development of original histories, data sets, and calculations, all of which were done in consultation with scholars trained in the relevant disciplines. Many of these can be found on whitebonus.com. Language. This is a book about race in America. It should not be surprising, then, that the most powerful racial epithet in our language, the one that begins with N and ends in R, came up intermittently. As a journalist, I resist changing language as it is spoken or in using general euphemisms, a racial slur, when a specific term is being referenced. That said, I've no interest in subjecting listeners to the visceral reaction that can arise from hearing violent language. In an attempt to strike a middle ground, where referencing that word was required as part of accurate documentation, I have substituted the N-word for the epithet. Prologue. In 2014, I watched footage of tanks facing off against unarmed protesters in Ferguson, Missouri. I thought, I knew this was what my country is like, but I pretended I did not. In 2016, I watched my professional peers scoff at Donald Trump's campaign, and my friends go along with them. I thought the sinking feeling in my stomach, the deep suspicion that he'd win, was a fluke. One more example of how I was too broke and too cynical to understand the new day dawning. When he won, I thought, I knew this was what my country is like. And I pretended I did not. In 2018, I watched Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing for the Supreme Court. I watched a grown man sputter and spew and sneer as he was asked to face consequences for his treatment of others. It was the same way my father spoke to me after that time he abused me. I thought, I knew this was what my country is like. And I pretended I did not. By 2020, when I watched the news about the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, I had exhausted my capacity to pretend. For the first time in my life, I could make out the long, heartbroken thread that began with being raised to endure, excuse, and ignore abuse directed at me. That ran on through my learning to endure, excuse, and ignore abuse directed at other people, and ended with me abusing people too. I quivered with rage at myself and my country and thought, I knew this was what we were like, and I cannot pretend anymore. Introduction. If American life is a river, relief from poverty and strife sits atop one of its slippery banks, and the American dream sits safely back from its edge. Few of us manage to plant our feet firmly enough in that soil to have no fear of it falling away. Fewer still are born there in the first place. Most of us, instead, start out somewhere in the water and do what we can to make it across. Family wealth determines our starting point. Economic class is the distance we must cover. In the river, our various privileges help us to stay afloat and ease our crossings. The biggest privileges are whiteness and maleness, but other aids may come along. Physical attractiveness, heterosexuality, physical strength, cunning, social intuition, innate abilities. Nobody is guaranteed safe crossing, but each buoyant scrap can be the difference between making it across the river and foundering in the current, each privilege of varying use if we make it ashore. It is dishonest to say that we all start to swim in the same place and with the same advantages, or that once we've arrived, we each enjoy the same security and comfort. It is an unsettling rejection of American meritocracy to admit that we do not. White Americans rarely talk about the differences in our crossings. Those who have reached the far bank often stay silent, content in having arrived. Many of those still in the river remain silent too, certain that speaking up will only make their crossing more difficult. Few of us consider how we might make getting across the river safer for everyone, or how to make that slippery bank a bit easier to climb. I have often stayed silent, and it has had its benefits, but I am no longer convinced it is for the best. That is a long way of saying that for a very long time I thought race and racism happened only to people who were not white. As a journalist, I reported on poverty and hardship, and could see plainly how racism kept non-white people down. I did not yet see how it pulled white people up. That limited approach mirrored the way that I'd been taught to understand race and racism. It wasn't about me. As a journalist who has long documented America's multiracial poor and working classes, and as a white woman raised here, I use this book to explore the flip side of that understanding, how race benefits people who are white. I start with my family and myself. For most of my adult life, I understood my place in the world through the lens of economic class. I grew up in a white, middle-class family. Footnote: class identity is vastly more complicated than income, also comprising, at minimum, wealth, culture, and the private safety net that each can provide. I engage with this broader experience of class throughout the book, but in the interest of storytelling, I use class as a shorthand for income. To that end, unless otherwise noted, reference to specific individuals' class status indicates where their estimated household income falls along the class income definitions developed by researchers at the Pew Research Center, and initially shared as part of the methodology of their December 2015 report, The American Middle Class is Losing Ground. As explained to me by Pew senior researcher Rakesh Kochar, those brackets, as a percentage of median income across the United States adjusted for household size, are lowest income, poor, up to 1/2 of median income; lower middle class, 1/2 to 2/3; middle class, 2/3 to double; upper middle class, double to triple; upper class rich, triple the median income and above. Unless otherwise noted, estimates referenced are based on the median income for all Americans of all races combined. My mother fell ill when I was 5 years old. The adults in my family discussed medical debt constantly. When I was 12, my mother moved to a nursing home. My father began to belittle me. Sometimes his temper boiled over and he flew into rages. To escape, I worked. My first paycheck came at 14 from an orchard. I have supported myself since college, when I juggled up to 5 jobs to make rent and tuition and pay for food. In those early years of independence, which I stubbornly insisted on to avoid my father's abuse, I was so malnourished I developed vertigo. Later, when I chose to pursue a career as a journalist covering the poor, despite its low pay, I often found myself without much more income than the people about whom I wrote. Unwittingly and always somewhat unnecessarily, I have periodically experienced something of what it is like to live in America without a net. It has terrified me each time. It terrifies me still. Few of the people I interacted with at the private university I attended, or in the journalism circles in which I worked, seem to have had similar experiences, whatever their race. Most of my peers came from families with enough wealth that they were baffled, if sometimes sympathetic, when I mentioned my financial stresses. In these circles, being white and without family support made me strange, which carried its own ironic benefits. More than anything, my struggles seemed to make me a curiosity, someone with an entertaining backstory for cocktail parties, or a target for sympathy, and, importantly, help. In college, when people heard that I worked to cover my living expenses, they assumed my lack of money in the present meant that my family was poor. Later, professional colleagues made similar assumptions when I said I'd worked service jobs in college and had avoided graduate school because I could not fathom its expense. I knew dimly that my grandfather had some wealth, but my access to it was limited by both family custom and my objection to my father's abuse. I avoided discussing those fraught topics with colleagues. Instead, I let my peers use the phrases they felt best described me. Eventually, working class stuck, and for self-interested reasons I discuss later, I made it my own. Until recently, it has been unusual in America to have a broad, mainstream discussion about how race works for white people, or how white advantage, much of it facilitated by government, intersects with the other factors that shape life in this country. For a very long time, I understood my race only dimly, as a vague, immutable power about which I had limited knowledge and even less control. Given the power my whiteness holds, it now feels strange, bizarre, even dangerous, that I entered adulthood with so little conscious understanding about how whiteness works and what whiteness means. This fact frustrates and embarrasses me, but it is nothing new for a white American. As a reporter, I know how to be specific about how race works for people who are not white, especially when they are black. I know that black children born poor in America are 1/4 as likely to become rich as poor children who are white. And I know that black boys born rich are half as likely to stay rich as their white peers. I know that black people are no more likely than whites to use or sell drugs, but they are 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested on drug charges. And I know that when they are convicted of any crime, black people are more likely to be sent to prison than white people. I know black families have 13% of the wealth of white ones. In this country, I am rarely expected to acknowledge the obvious inverse, that white people born rich are twice as likely as black people to stay that way. That we are 2/3 to 3/4 less likely to be arrested on drug charges, that we have 8 times as much wealth. Indeed, for all the difficulties of my crossing, whiteness has buoyed me up in my hardest moments. Some of the benefits of my race are hard to measure. My ability to blend in among white people with more power, to safely express anger in public, or to prompt sympathy with my tears. Others are easier to quantify. Racist policies in housing let my grandparents build middle-class wealth that was denied to Americans who were not white. Racist administration of the GI Bill gave them access to college that was largely denied to Americans who were not white. And racism ingrained in the publishing industry gave me advantages that led to the contract for my first book, and the contract for this one, too. There are many others, and they are documented in this book. I know that this book puts white people at its center, myopically focused on our experience as if it is the only one worth understanding. I know that mainstream journalists in particular have practiced this myopia almost as if it were a religion. And, as I document later, I know that I have not only observed these damaging practices, I have participated in them too. But if there is any story about white Americans that this country has left untold, It is the story of how I, directly benefit from racism. I've spent my career documenting how racism harms people who are not white, especially in the form of poverty, in hopes of making the lives of our poorest better. Not much has changed. Maybe I can do more good by documenting this untold story of exactly how racism helps me, just as it helps nearly all white Americans. That is the story at the center of this book. This is a sprawling story. To tell it, I must break it into smaller, more manageable stories, and then weave them together into that larger whole. I begin with my family's story and end with my own, tallying what I have come to call a white bonus along the way. This concept is a clear inverse of what scholars and journalists have long referred to as the black tax, the higher costs faced by Black Americans who have been denied so much of the aid extended freely to whites. Footnote: although it has many roots, the concept of the black tax received a thorough journalistic treatment by Chicago Tribune journalist Clarence Page in 1980. Today, its greatest chronicler is Georgetown law scholar Dorothy Brown, whose work, summarized in her 2021 book, The Whiteness of Wealth, has rigorously documented the racist effects of American tax policy. To begin tallying that bonus, I've chosen a crude but telling measure: the total money my family has spent on me since I left home at 17 years old. The reasoning is simple. It is money I did nothing to earn, that my family had no legal obligation to spend on me, and that my family was able to give. Then I look at my family's history and use my skills as a journalist to investigate, would my family have had that money to give if they were not white? When the answer is no, the money comes from racial advantage. This initial family bonus is almost exclusively a measure of how American public policy, which built the 20th century's middle class, has trickled down to the current day. This is the first piece of my white bonus. The next element of white advantage I consider derives from what the pioneering 19th century Black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called whiteness's psychological wage, the comforts and benefits that come from being a member of a dominant group. These are the small, interpersonal ways that doorways to power are opened. The offering of benefit of the doubt and encouragement rather than suspicion and dismissal, which in turn encourages white people to tacitly believe they are entitled to things that others are not. Although these advantages begin as intangible privileges, they facilitate access to material advantages. This indirect relationship makes it difficult to measure this element of white advantage, what I call a social bonus of whiteness. Still, when any event arose in my subjects' lives where it appeared that implicit white advantage yielded material benefits, I have tallied those too. Any honest consideration of a white bonus, though, must also address a related element: racism's cost to all of us. This is different from the amorphous concepts of privilege and fragility that have dominated America's discussion of whiteness in recent years. Its most recent champion is writer and policy expert Heather McGhee, who speaks compellingly about how racism hits the target first and worst. Racism then hurts non-white and especially Black people the most, but it hurts many whites as well. This broader understanding of racism is an important complement to, not a replacement for, the extraordinary body of work chronicling racism's harms to its direct targets. Footnote: while the list of cited works in the bibliography provides deeper guidance to this work, I am thinking here of the journalism of Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Clint Smith, and Isabel Wilkerson, the memoirs of Sarah Broom, Jessamine Ward, and Kiese Lehman, and the scholarship of Dorothy Brown, Tracie McMillan Cotton, Nell Irvin Painter, and William A. Darity, Jr. It also begs a question that drives this book. If racism in American policy has given so much to whites, Is there a point at which its costs outweigh its benefits, even to white people? This book is, by its nature, limited. There are many caveats. I work as a journalist, not a scholar, and certainly not an economist. I cannot take a full measure of the material benefits of racism, and as many economists have told me, it is likely that no one can. Racism is too complex, too slippery, too multifaceted to pin down its value in a definitive way. The same is true of racism's costs, which land on the bodies and psyches of its targets in ways that defy monetary calculation. Indeed, public health scholar Arlene Geronimus coined the term weathering to describe the way that the stresses of oppression of all kinds directly create poor health. But while this stress effect shows up across many hardships, it is most pronounced and most widespread among Black Americans, whose health, researchers have found, does not improve with income and education the way it does for whites. For Black people in the middle and upper classes, research suggests a lifetime of managing a constant flow of white assumptions, ranging from banal to lethal, can spur disease at an early age and even shorten their lives, regardless of how much money they make. There is, as of yet, no firm dollar value for that. Footnote: in a forthcoming 2024 article, William A. Darity, Jr., the Duke economist, explores the idea of paying reparations to Black Americans based on their shorter lifespans, as opposed to the bulk of his work on reparations, which focuses on the racial wealth gap. In RSF, the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences, Darity estimates that the cost of a reparations program based on longevity would be about $29 trillion, more than twice the estimate generated by focusing on the wealth gap. In this way, any estimate I offer will be woefully, dramatically, impossibly insufficient. And yet there is value in posing a powerful question and following the answers where they lead, even if the math is rough. There is no algorithm here, no econometric model. There is only a question that needed to be asked, and the stories I learned when I tried to answer it. I begin with my family because I know our story best. This is different from how I have approached most of my work as a journalist. For many years, my job has been to approach other people and ask them to explain a foreign experience to me, so that I might explain it to others. But it didn't feel right to ask other white people to explain whiteness to me, as if I had no experience with it myself, as if I had any claim to objectivity at all. Following journalistic convention, I aim to accurately reflect the thoughts and experiences of my subjects, while leaving most of the work of judgment to readers. Following the conventions of memoir, I am more direct about how I see myself and my family. As this work evolved, it became clear that any honest consideration of my own relationship to racism, which as a white woman means my relationship to unearned power, also meant being honest about the hardships that have shaped me. For a long time, I shrugged off my difficult childhood. I told myself that it was in the past, and that at least it had made me stronger and more empathetic. I suppose those things are true, insofar as they go. I see now that they made me more resentful, too. More willing to endure abuse, more willing to expect others to endure it, angry when others got sympathy where I expected derision. Because white Americans' resentment is so central to modern racism here, my hardships are part of my relationship to racism, too. Still, the story of white advantage in America is a bigger story than any single family can tell. So in between the 6 chapters that tell my family's story, I have written 4 profiles of other white people. They are from different parts of the country, different generations, different gradations of economic class. Each subject has spent most, if not all, of their life in America's shrinking middle class. Several are poised near the downward slide from middle class to poor, reflecting, I think, an uncertainty about whether their economic stability will last. But the most important criterion was that they each agreed to speak with me openly about their lives and to consider the role that their race has played in shaping them. My hope is that this cross-section of stories will help me understand how racism has shaped histories and policies to which my own family has few ties. I also suspect it will let me see how racism echoes across time and place, how it morphs, and whether parts of it disappear. As big as this story is, I have limited its scope in 3 important ways. First, I cover only the 20th and 21st centuries. This excludes the 246 years during which enslavement based on race was a legally codified part of America's economic and political structure, as well as the 35 years, including Reconstruction, that followed the Civil War. Footnote. Here I am using the year 1619 as the introduction of enslavement as part of the American economy, continuing through late 1865, when passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed enslavement in all states. I had to draw a line somewhere, and I believe the last 124 years provide plenty of insight into how racism has given advantage to white Americans. Second, this book is primarily concerned with the divide between the experiences of Black Americans and white Americans. I have chosen this approach because the divide between Black and white is so enduring here that to call it caste, as the journalist Isabel Wilkerson does, is accurate. I hope that future work, by me or other writers, will clearly contrast white advantage against the complex histories between white and other non-white Americans, including those of Hispanic, Indigenous, and Asian descent. Third, all of my primary subjects are white, and I do not systematically compare them to subjects who are not white. I have made this decision in hopes of forcing myself to study white advantage and white advantage alone. I do not like to admit it, but there is a relief I feel when I listen to stories of how racism hurts people who don't look like me. There is the relief of absolution in exchange for having borne witness, and the relief of maintaining my innocence. Most of all, there is the relief of having kept the focus off of me. I do not trust this relief, which keeps me so comfortable and does so little to change anything. I am curious about what I might learn about racism by leaving that relief behind, and practicing honesty instead. This book does not highlight the extraordinary, and it does not study an average either. None of my subjects have faced hardships that will sound foreign to most Americans. None of us have gone through life guaranteed the comforts of great wealth. Indeed, there is nothing about my family or the people I profile that is remarkable. Nor is any one of us an everyman who could represent an average of anything. Instead, my hope is that, by studying the ways that racism has shaped this handful of white American families, including my own, I can better understand why racism continues to fester in my country, why so many white Americans treat racial hierarchy as a fact they cannot change, rather than a problem they will confront, and whether there's any chance that the benefits it gives are not worth what they cost. I hope that writing this book can help me find a better way to cross the river. For myself, of course, and for all Americans. I believe we all deserve safe passage. The story that follows is what I learned by trying to find it. 1. My grandparents. Southeast Michigan, Canada, and Michigan's Upper Peninsula, 1907 to 1943. For most of my adulthood, I've understood myself to be on the border of the working and middle class. Even so, I have longed to feel myself on solid financial ground, far enough into the middle class that I have no immediate worry of falling back into the river. So when my father moved out of my childhood home in 2016 and handed me the family albums he no longer wanted to keep, The old pictures I found of his parents surprised me.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?